Hey folks, my name is John Lay and welcome back to the channel. Now, the very first video that I made for this YouTube channel was a movie review for this movie right over here. The title in Korean is Partitioning, but in English the title is Ode to My Father. But no matter where you look, you will never find that video. And that's because within 24 hours of having uploaded that video, it was immediately taken down because it violated copyright claims. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it stung when that first happened, but ever since then I made a bunch more videos and not one of them has been flagged for copyright violations. And so now that I think I know what I'm doing in regards to making videos that do not violate copyright laws, I want to come back again to talk about this movie. Now, why do I want to talk about this movie again? Well, the answer is simple. This movie covers a vast array of South Korean history from 1950 all the way up to 2014 when this movie first came out. And let's start with a synopsis real quick. The movie's main character is Toksu. He starts as an old man, but it doesn't take very long for us to get a first flashback scene. And when the first flashback scene begins, we immediately take into the Korean War. Now, from the very beginning, this movie starts with an immediately impactful scene. There's nothing as big as the Korean War when it comes to modern day South Korean history. And so, during the Korean War, at this point when the movie starts, the Chinese have just entered the war and are now aiding their North Korean allies. And Toksu and his family are fleeing down south with his family. Now, while they're trying to flee down to South Korea, Toksu unfortunately loses his father and his youngest sister. But with the rest of his two siblings and his mother, Toksu makes it down to South Korea. Now, while they are in South Korea, Toksu is now the head of the family. At this point, Toksu is still just a child, but because he's the eldest son, and because the father is no longer in the picture, by Confucian value standards, he is now the head of the family. And from that point on, it is Toksu's responsibility to take care of all of his family members. And it is because of this responsibility that Toksu ends up getting swept up in rather extraordinary historical events that occur in South Korea. As Toksu becomes an adult, he eventually has to work in a coal mine in West Germany, as well as a contractor in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And also, he takes part in a historic TV show where divided families that were divided during the Korean War get reunited. Toksu is an ordinary man who gets swept up by extraordinary events. In a lot of ways, this movie is a bit like the Korean version of Forrest Gump. There's a lot of history there's a lot of history that there's to cover in this movie. And so, now that we've got the synopsis out of the way, I want to talk about the first part of this movie, which is about the Korean War. Now, before I begin, I just want to point out by saying that I'm not going to talk about the entire history of the Korean War. That would take hours upon hours upon hours of video. And this is not exactly hardcore history, so let's get ourselves out of that mindset. All I want to talk about is the partition of the Korean Peninsula that led to the Korean War. Alright, so let's begin by talking about the mentality of the South Korean people today. Now, according to what I've heard, I have no way of independently verifying this, there is a significant number of North Koreans who seek reunification. However, that is not so much the case anymore in South Korea. Now, in 2020, the partitioning of the Korean Peninsula is no longer as a sore subject as it once was. It's been more than 70 years since the South Korean Peninsula has been divided, and since that time, especially those of us in South Korea, have developed into a prosperous economy and into a functioning democratic country. And as time has gone on, those who actually have first-hand memories of the war are, sad to say, dying out, and those who are still young and thriving no longer have any memory of a united Korean peninsula. As far as many younger people are concerned, the only country that they've ever known is South Korea. But that's not to say that everything has been forgotten or forgiven. Now, toward the end of the Second World War, when it was clear that the Axis powers were about to be defeated, then it became a matter of the United States and the Soviet Union no longer really trusting each other all that much. And to be fair, both countries were right to be suspicious of each other's expansionist aims. What confounds Koreans, however, was that those two countries' competition eventually affected Koreans. Now, over in Europe, when the Nazis were completely defeated, the eastern part of Germany was taken over by the Soviet Union and the west was taken over by the United States. Now, the partitioning of Germany was a tragic event for the German people. But objectively speaking, it made sense to partition Germany. Germany was one of the aggressor nations during that war, and so it made sense for the Soviets and the Americans to make a demarcation line within Germany to separate their different spheres of influence. In Asia, however, it wasn't the aggressor nation that was divided. In Asia, Japan was the aggressor nation. At the time, Korea, the government or the state, neither of it existed. In fact, to add insult to injury, not only was South Korea partitioned and forced to fight a bloody civil war, Japan, on the other hand, was spared the fate of being partitioned and also had its economy prosper because by this point the United States needed Japan to become a prosperous ally and was thus also excused from having to pay wartime reparations through the Treaty of San Francisco. From Korea's point of view, this was really unjust. Now, this is not to say that Koreans were somehow innocent regarding the partition and the subsequent war. Both South and North Korea were ruled by egomaniacal thugs. And it was because of their power lust that both South and North Korea eventually ended up becoming proxies for the superpowers. Instead of cooperation, instead of communication that sought to benefit the interests of the people, they both sought personal power. The leadership in both North and South Korea was myopic and it was toxic. And it was that leadership that led to the deaths of millions of people and the separation of the entire country for more than 70 years. Now, the Korean War was brutal and devastating. It is estimated that about 5 million Koreans died. Half of them were civilians, and about 40,000 American troops were killed, and about 100,000 were wounded. And the most ironic thing about the Korean War is that by the time it was suspended, and I said suspended, not by the time it was over, by the time it was suspended, very little had changed. The border between North and South Korea had barely moved at all. In America, the Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. But to be honest, it would be more accurate to call the Korean War the Pointless War. Now, the movie doesn't really focus on the Korean War all that much, and neither will I. While it's true that the events that take place during the Korean War is an important plot point that drives the rest of the movie forward, the rest of the movie is focused on how people move on from that war. And that brings me to this picture of the Korean Peninsula. It is a famous picture, which I'm sure that you might have seen yourself, but as you can see, the northern half of the Korean Peninsula is literally steeped in darkness, whereas the southern half is blanketed by light. Now, when this picture is usually shown, it's paired with this story, and the story is a simplistic one that goes like this. Communism leads to ruin, and capitalism leads to prosperity. Now, there is an element of truth to that. There is no communist country on earth that actually prospered. But that very simplistic narrative is incredibly cringe-inducing. What I'm trying to say is that South Korea's economic prosperity is not the result of a simplistic battle between communism and capitalism. South Korea's prosperity is a very complicated topic. In fact, South Korea was not exactly a really capitalist country for a very long time. It was anti-communist, but that didn't make it capitalist. So in the next video, we are going to talk about the movie's take on South Korea's economic prosperity, as well as compare it to the historical realities that paved the way forward. Okay, that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell. And if you have a comment to share, feel free to leave it down below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all in the next video.